There we go. Okay, looks like everything is going fine. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Let's Read Resident Evil City of the Dead. Last time we got through 8 chapters, that includes the prologue, so through chapter 7. And I just thought that I would continue to pick up where I left off with everyone. Hi Kitty, good to see you here too. So where did we leave off last time? Let me find my page, because I did not bookmark this like a fool. That's 14. Wow, that's like double the amount. It does not feel like we got anywhere in this book. That is 9. These should be at 8. Okay. Alright, so last time we left off with Ada, who was just going about her business inside the police station. This time around, we're going to be... oh, this is chapter 7. We left off with on 7, didn't we? So we need to get to 8. That's right, we got through... basically, Leon and Claire arriving at the... Leon, he's at the gun shop, and Claire gets to the police station. And at the police station, the helicopter has just crashed. So that's where we left off with Claire. So now let's pick up with Police Chief Brian Irons in Chapter 8. Is everyone ready to just jump right into this? Hello, Felix. Okay. Chapter 8. Chief of Police Brian Irons was standing in front of in one of his private corridors trying to catch his breath when he felt a shuddering impact rumble through the building. He heard it, too. Heard something. A distant splintering sound, heavy and abrupt. The roof, he thought. The roof, he thought distantly. Something on the roof. He didn't bother... well, he doesn't really have that voice. He's more of a smooth person. The roof, he thought distantly. Something on the roof. He didn't bother following the thought of to any kind of conclusion. Whatever had happened, it couldn't make things any worse. Oh! Kiyotaka Uchiha, nice for you to join us. I hope you enjoy your stay on the channel. We're on the live stream. Irons pushed away from the stone wall with one well-padded hip, hefting Beverly as gently as he could. They'd be at the elevator in a moment, and there was just a short walk to his office. He could rest there, and then, he mumbled, that's the question, isn't it? And then what? Beverly didn't answer. Perfect features remained still and silent, her eyes closed, but seemed to nestle closer to him, her long, slender body curling against his chest. It was his imagination, surely. Beverly Harris, the mayor's daughter. Youthful, stunning Beverly, who so often haunted his guilty dreams with her blonde beauty. Irons hugged her closer and continued towards the elevator, trying not to let his exhaustion show in case she woke up. By the time he reached the lift, his back and arms were aching. He probably should have left her in his private hobby room, the room he'd always thought of as a sanctuary. It was quiet there, and probably one of the safest areas in the station, but when he decided to go to the office to collect his journal and a few personal items, he found that he simply couldn't stand to leave her behind. She looked so vulnerable, so innocent. He'd promised Harris that he would watch out for her, and what if she was attacked in his absence? What if he came back with the office and she was just gone? Gone like everything else. A decade of work, networking, making the connections, careful positioning. All of it. Just like that. Irons lowered her to the cold floor and opened the elevator gate, trying desperately not to think about all that he'd lost. Beverly was the important thing now. Going to keep you safe, he murmured. And did one corner of that perfect mouth rise slightly? Did she know that she was safe, that Uncle Brian was taking care of her? When she was a child, when he used to frequent the Harrises for dinner, she called him that, Uncle Brian. She knows. Of course she knows. He half dragged her into the lift and leaned her into the corner, gazing tenderly at the angelic face. He was suddenly overwhelmed by a rush of almost paternal love for her, and wasn't surprised to feel tears well up in his eyes, tears of pride and affection. For days now, he'd been subject to an emotional outburst. Rage, terror, even joy. He'd never been particularly emotional mad, but he had grown to accept the powerful feeling, even to enjoy them after a fashion. At least they weren't confusing. He also had moments when he'd been overcome by a kind of strange, creeping haze, a formless anxiety that left him feeling deeply unsettled and bewildered as a lost child. Sup, Late George? No more of those. There's nothing else that can go wrong now. Beverly's with me, and once I collect my things, we can make a way in the sanctuary and get some rest. She'll need time to recover, and I can sort things through. Yes, that's it. Things need to be sorted through. He blinked, the already forgotten tears away, as the metal cage around him started to rise, unholstering his sidearm and ejecting the clip to count how many rounds were left. Magazine! Sorry. His private rooms were safe, but the office was another story. He wanted to be prepared. The elevator came to a stop, and Irons propped open the gate with one leg before lifting the girl, grunting with his exertion. He carried her as he would have carried a sleeping child, her cool, smooth body limp in his arms, her head rolled back and wobbling as he walked. He picked her up awkwardly, and the white gown had hiked up to expose her tight, creamy skin of her thigh. Irons forced his gaze away, concentrating on the panel controls that opened the wall in front of his office. Whatever harmless fantasies he'd had before, she was his responsibility now, and he was her protector, her white knight. We're on Chapter 8. If you guys have copies of the book, please feel free to open to where I am. I'm on Chapter 8, page 76, as far as you can tell. He was about to hit the protruding button with one knee. He was able to hit the protruding button with one knee. The wall slid open, revealing a plushy, decorated, and thankfully empty office. Only a blank, glassy stares of his animal trophies greeted them. The massive walnut desk that he had imported from Italy was right in front of him, and his stamina was going fast. Beverly was a petite woman, but he wasn't in the shape he used to be. He quickly laid her on the desk, pushing a couple of pencils to the floor with his elbow. There, he exhaled deeply, smiling down at her. She didn't smile back, but he sensed that she would be awake soon, like before. He reached under the desk and tapped the wall controls. The panel slid closed behind them. He had been cornered when he'd first found her. Oh, excuse me. He had been concerned when he had first found her, asleep on the office next to Officer Scott in the back hall. George Scott was dead, covered in wounds, and when Irons had seen that splash of red on Beverly's stomach, he'd been afraid that she was dead too. But when he'd taken her to the sanctuary, to his safe place, she'd whispered to him that she didn't feel well and that she was hurt, that she wanted to go home. Did she really? Irons' frown snapped out of the uncertain memory by something he felt when he laid her on his hobby table and straightened her blood-stained gown, something he couldn't quite recall. It hadn't seemed important at the time, but now, away from his hidden comforts of the sanctuary, it was nagging at him, reminding him that he had suffered one of those confusing moments when he'd felt the cold, rubbery jelly of intestines beneath my fingers, touched her. Beverly, he whispered, sitting down behind his desk Beverly, he whispered, sitting down behind his desk when his legs suddenly went weak. Beverly kept her silence, and a turbulent flood of emotions hit Irons like a tidal wave, crashing over him, crowding his mind with images and memories and truths that he didn't want to accept. Cutting the outside lines after the first attacks, Umbrella and Birkin and The Walking Dead, the slaughter in the garage when the bright, coppery scent of blood had filled the air and Mayor Harris had been eaten alive, screaming until the very end. The dwindling numbers of the living through the first long and terrible night, and the cold, brutal realization that had hit him again and again, and that his city, was no more. Sup, Thomas? After that, the confusion. The strange and hysterical joy that had come when he understood that there would be no consequences for his actions. Irons remembered the game he'd played on the second night, after some of Birkin's pets had found their way into the station and had taken out all but a few of the remaining cops. He'd found Neil Carson cowering in the library and had tracked him, hunting the sergeant down like an animal. What did it matter? What matters now that my life in Raccoon is over? All that was left, the only thing that he had to hold on to, was the sanctuary, and the part of him that had created it, the dark and glorious heart inside of his own that he had always had to keep hidden away. That part of him was free now. Irons looked at the corpse of Beverly Harris, laid out across the desk like some kind of delicate and fragile dream, and felt that he might be torn apart from the feelings of fear and doubt that warred inside of him. Had he killed her? He couldn't remember. Uncle Brian. 10 years ago, I was her Uncle Brian. What have I become? It was too much. Without taking his gaze from her lifeless face, he pulled the loaded VP-70 from its holster and began to rub the barrel with a thumb and with a numb finger. Gentle strokes that reassured him somehow that the weapon turned as the weapon turned towards him. When the bore was pressed firmly against his soft belly, he felt that some kind of peace might be within reach. His fingers settled across the trigger, and it was then that Beverly whispered to him again, her lips still, her sweet musical voice coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Don't leave me, Uncle Brian. You said you'd keep me safe, that you'd take care of me. Think of what you could do now that everyone is gone, and that there's nothing to stop you. You're dead, he whispered, but still kept talking. But she kept talking, soft and insistent. Nothing to stop you from being fulfilled, truly fulfilled for the first time in your life. Tortured and aching, Iron slowly pulled the 9mm away from his stomach. After a moment, he rested his forehead against Beverly's shoulder and closed his eyes. She was right. He couldn't leave her. He promised, and there was something that she had said about all the things he could do. His hobby table was big enough to accommodate all kinds of animals. Iron sighed, not sure what to do next, and wondered why he was in such a hurry to decide anyway. They would rest for a while, perhaps even take a nap together. And when they awoke, things would be clear again. Yes, that was it. They would rest, and then he would be able to sort things through, take care of business. He was the chief of police, after all. Feeling in control of himself again, Brian Iron slipped into a light, uneasy doze, Beverly's cool flesh like a balm against his feverish brow. Chapter 9. Thanks to a van parked in the alley behind Kendo's, Leon's straight shot to the station had taken a few detours. Through an infested basketball court, another alley, and a parked bus that had reeked from the sprawled corpses inside. It was a nightmare, punctured with whispering howls, the stink of decay, and once a distant explosion that made his limbs feel weak. And though he had to shoot 3 more of the Walking Dead and was wired to the teeth with adrenaline and horror, he somehow managed to hold it on his hope that the RPD building would be a safe haven, that there would be some kind of crisis center set up, manned by police and paramedics, people in authority making decisions and marshalling forces. It wasn't just a hope, it was a need. The possibility that there might be no one left in Raccoon to take charge was unthinkable. When he finally stumbled out onto the street in front of the station, he saw the burning squad cars. He felt like he had been hit in the gut. But it was the sight of the decaying, mowing police officers staggering around the dancing flames that truly wiped out his hope. There were only about 50 or 60 cops in the whole RPD force, and a full third of them were lurching through the wreckage or dead and bloody on the pavement not 100 feet from the front door of the station. Leon forced the despair away, fixing his sights on the gate that led to the RPD building's courtyard. Whether or not anyone had survived, he had to stick with his plan, put out a call for help, and there was Claire to think about. Concentrating on his fears would only make it harder to do whatever was needed to be done. He ran for the gate, nimbly dodging a horribly burned uniformed cop with blackened bones for fingers. As he clutched the cold metal handle and pushed, he realized that some part of him was growing numb to the tragedy, to the understanding that these things had once been the citizens of Raccoon. The creatures that roamed the streets were no less horrible, but the shock of it all couldn't be sustained. There were too many of them. Not too many here, thank God. Leon slammed the gate shut behind him and pushed his sweaty hair off his brow, taking a deep breath of the almost fresh air as he scanned the courtyard. The small grassy park to his right was well lit, enough for him to see that there was only a few of the once human creatures and none close enough to be a threat. He could see the 2 flags that adorned the front of the station, hanging limp in the still shadows, and the sight re-sparked hope that he had thought he had lost. Whatever else happened, he'd at least made it to some place he knew, and it had to be safer than the streets. He hurried past a blindly reeling trio of the dead, easily avoiding them, 2 men and a woman. All 3 could have passed for normal if not for their mournful, hungry cries and the uncoordinated staggers. They must have died recently. But they're not dead. Dead people don't gush blood when you shoot them, not to mention the walking around and trying to eat people thing. Dead people didn't walk, and living people tended to fall down after they'd been shot a few times with a 50 caliber slug, and didn't put up with their rotting flesh on their bones. Questions he hadn't yet had time to ask himself flooded through his mind as he jogged up the front steps of the station. Questions he didn't have the answers for, but he would soon. He was sure of it. The door wasn't locked, but Leon didn't allow himself to feel surprised. With all he had been through since he had hit town, he figured that it would be best to keep his expectations to a minimum. He pushed it open and stepped inside, Magnum raised and his fingers on the trigger. Empty. There was no sign of life in the grand old lobby of the RPD building. Record, the song that we're playing now is the main theme of the hall that he's actually currently entering. It's one of the best songs in all of Resident Evil. And no sign of disaster that had overtaken Raccoon. Leon gave up on not feeling surprised, closing the door behind him and stepping down into the sunken lobby. Hello? Leon kept his voice low, but it carried echoing back to him in a whisper. Everything looked just as he remembered it. 3 floors of classically styled architecture and oak and marble. There was a stone statue of a woman carrying a water pitcher in the lower part of the larger room, a ramp on either side leading up to the receptionist area. The RPD seal set into the floor in front of the statue gleamed softly in the diffuse light of the wall lamps, as if it had just been polished. No bodies, no blood, not even a shell casing. If there was an attack here, where the hell is the evidence? Uneasy at the profound silence of the huge chamber, Leon walked up the ramp to his left, stopping at the counter of the reception desk and leaning over it. Except for the fact that it was unmanned, nothing seemed out of place. There was a phone on the desk below the counter. Leon picked up the receiver and cradled it between his head and shoulder, tapping on the buttons with his finger that felt cold and distant. Not even a dial tone. All he heard was the sound of his own heavy thumping heart. Hi, Dr. Pepper, how's it going? Yeah, I found it weird that we don't see any more variety of, like, animals in Raccoon City. Like, it would be awesome to see, like, cat zombies, raccoon zombies. It'd be freaking terrifying, man. They're tiny. Not even a dial tone, all he heard was the sound of his own heavily thumping heart. He put down the phone and turned his face to the empty room, trying to decide where to go first. As much as he wanted to find Claire, he also desperately wanted to hook up with some other cops. Oh, Leon's into that kinky stuff, I guess. No, I'm kidding. He received a copy of an RPD memo just a couple of weeks before, stating that several of the departments were going to be relocated. That didn't really matter if there were cops inside hiding in the building. They probably weren't concerned with sticking close to their desks. There were 3 doors leading away from the lobby to different parts of the sprawling station. 2 on the west side and 2 on the other on the east. Of the 2 on the west, one led through a series of halls towards the back of the building, past a couple of filing offices and a briefing room. The second opened to a uniformed officer squad room and lockers, which when connected into one of the corridors near the stairs to the second floor. The east door, in fact, the whole east side of the first floor, was primarily for the detectives. Offices, interrogation, and a press room. There was also access to the basement and another set of stairs on the outside of the building. Claire probably came through the garage, or through the back lot of the roof, or through the back lot to the roof. Or she could have circled around and come through the same door he had, assuming she'd even made it to the station. She could be anywhere, and considering that the building took up almost an entire city block, that was a lot of ground to cover. Finally deciding that he had to start somewhere, he walked towards the squad room for the beat cops, where his own locker would be. A random choice, but he'd spent more time there than anywhere else in the station, interviewing and working through scheduling. Besides, it was closest, and the tomb-like silence of the oversized lobby was giving him the creeps. The door wasn't locked, and Leon pushed it open slowly, holding his breath and hoping that the room would be as undisturbed and orderly as the lobby. What he saw inside was the confirmation of his earlier fears. The creatures had been there, with a vengeance. The long room had been trashed, tables and chairs splintered and overturned everywhere. Everywhere he looked. Smears of dried blood decorated the wall, splashes and tacky trailing puddles on the floor leading towards... Oh, man. The cop was sitting at the lockers to his left, his legs splayed half hidden by a smashed table. At the sound of Leon's voice, he weakly raised one shaking arm, pointing a weapon vaguely in Leon's direction, then lowered it again, seemingly exhausted by the effort. His midsection was awash with oozing blood, his dark features contorted with pain. Leon was crouching at his side in 2 steps, gently touching his shoulders. He couldn't see the wound, but there was so much blood that he knew it was bad. "Who are you?" the cop whispered. The soft, almost dreamy tone of his voice scared Leon as much as the still oozing wound and the glassy look in his dark eyes. The man was slipping fast. They never formally met, but Leon had seen him before. The young African-American beat cop had been pointed out to him as sharp on the fast track to be detective. Marvin Branagh. I'm Kennedy. What happened here?" Leon asked, his hand still on Branagh's shoulder. A sickly heat radiated through the officer's ragged shirt. "About 2 months ago," Branagh rasped. "The cannibal murders. The stars found zombies out at this mansion in the woods." He coughed weakly, and Leon saw a small bubble of blood from the corner of his mouth. Leon started to tell him to be still to rest, but Branagh's faraway gaze had fixed on his own. The cop seemed determined to tell the story, whatever it was costing him. "Chris and the others discovered that Umbrella was behind the whole thing. Risked their lives. No one believed them. Then this." Chris Redfield? Claire's brother? Leon hadn't made the connection before, although he had known something about the trouble with the stars. He only heard bits and pieces of the story. The suspension of the Special Tactics and Rescue Squad after their alleged mishandling of the murder cases that have been the reason the RPD's been hiring new cops. I'm Bond. Badly damaged police officer James Bond. He'd read the names of the infamous STARS members in some local paper, listed along with some fairly impressive career records. And Umbrella runs this town. Some kind of chemical leak, something that they tried to cover up by getting rid of the stars. All this went through his mind in a split second. Then Branagh coughed again, the sound even weaker than before. "Hang in there," Leon said, and quickly looked around, looking for something to use to stop the bleeding, inwardly kicking himself for not having done it already. A locker next to Branagh was partly open. A crumpled t-shirt lay at the bottom. Leon scooped it up and folded it haphazardly, pressing it against Branagh's stomach. The cop placed his own bloody hand over the makeshift bandage, closing his eyes as he spoke again in a wheezing gasp. "Don't worry about me. You have to try and rescue the survivors." The resignation in Branagh's voice was horribly plain. Leon shook his head, wanting to deny the truth, wanting to do something to ease Branagh's pain, but the wounded cop was dying, and there was no one to call for help. "Not fair. It's not fair." "Go!" Branagh breathed, his eyes still closed. Branagh was right, there was nothing else Leon could do, but he couldn't move for a moment, until Branagh raised his weapon again, pointing it at him with a sudden burst of energy that strengthened his voice into a rough shout. "Just go!" Branagh commanded, and Leon stood up, wondering if he would be as selfless in the same situation, working to convince himself that Branagh would make it somehow. "I'll be back," Leon said firmly, but Branagh's arm was already drooping, his head settling against his heaving chest. Rescue the survivors. Leon backed towards the door, swallowing heavily and struggling to accept the change in plan that would very well kill him, but that he couldn't walk away from. Official or no, he was a cop. If there were any other survivors, it was his moral and civic duty to try and help them. There was a weapons store in the basement near the parking garage. Leon opened the door and stepped back into the lobby, praying that the lockers would be well stocked, and that there would be someone left for him to help. James Bond would be freaking awesome in a zombie situation. Motherfucker is cold as ice. He'd be like Ada Wong, but not stupid. Occasionally stupid. Chapter 10. From the burning rooftop, Claire moved through a snaking hallway littered with broken glass and past a very dead cop, a bloody testament to her fears about the station's safety. She quickly stepped over the body and moved on, her nervous tension growing. A cool breeze ruffled through the shattered window that lined the hall, making the darkness alive. There were shiny black feathers stuck in the streaks of blood that painted the floorboards, and their soft, wavering dance had her jerking the semi-automatic towards every single shadow. She passed a door that she had thought led back outside to a set of external stairs, but she kept going, taking a right towards the center of the building. The way the helicopter had buried itself in the roof was gnawing at her, inspiring visions of the old station going up in flames. From the looks of things, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Dead bodies and bloody handprints on the wall. Claire wasn't happy about the idea of touring the station. Still, death by fire didn't carry as much appeal either. She needed to see how bad it was before she went looking for Leon. The corridor dead-ended at a door that felt cool to the touch. Mentally crossing her fingers, Claire opened it and stumbled back as a wave of acrid smoke washed over her. The smell of burnt metal and wood thickened the heated air. She dropped to a crouch and edged forward again, peering down the hall that stretched off to her right. The hall turned right again, maybe 30 feet down, and although she couldn't see the fire proper, bright fiery light was reflected off the gray-paneled walls at the corner. The popping crackle of the unseen flames was magnified by the tight corridors, the sound as mindlessly hungry as the moans of the zombies down in the courtyard. Well, shit! What now? There was another door diagonally across from where she crouched, only a few steps away. Claire took a deep breath and moved, walking low to stay beneath the thick blanket of smoke, hoping that she could find a fire extinguisher, and that a fire extinguisher could be enough to put out whatever blaze the crashed copper had created. Playing COD. Nice, I'm writing a fantasy alien cyborg race. I've seen parts of it and I feel like baby form could be... I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe I'm missing context here? Okay. The door opened to an empty waiting room. A couple of green vinyl couches and a rounded corner desk with another door across from the one she'd entered. The small room seemed untouched, as sterile and as quietly unassuming as she might have expected. And unlike just about everywhere else she'd been tonight, there was no lurking disaster in the mild shadows thrown by the overhead fluorescents. No stench of rot or shuffling zombies. And no fire extinguisher. Not in plain sight, anyway. She closed the door on the smoky corridor and stepped towards the desk, lifting the entrance flap with a barrel of her gun. There was an old manual typewriter on the counter, and next to that, a telephone. Claire grabbed for it and hoping against hope, but heard only dead air through the receiver. Sighing, she dropped it and ducked down to check on the shelves beneath the counter. A phone book, a few stacks of papers, and then, half hidden by a woman's purse on the bottom shelf, was the familiar red shape she had been hoping to find, coated with a thin layer of dust. There you are, she murmured, and paused just long enough to stick the 9mm into her vest before hefting the heavy cylinder. She'd never used one before, but it looked simple enough. A metal handle with a locking pin and a black rubber nozzle hooked to the side. It was only a couple of feet long, but it weighed a good 40 or 50 pounds. She figured that meant it was full. Armed with the extinguisher, Claire stepped back to the door and started to take short, sharp breaths, filling her lungs. It made her feel lightheaded, but the hyperventilation would allow her to hold her breath longer. She didn't want to keel over from smoke inhalation before she had a chance to put it out. A final deep breath and she opened the door, crouching her way back into the now noticeably hotter corridor. The haze of the smoke had gotten thicker too, extending down the hall from the ceiling in a dark, choking fog at least 4 feet deep. Keep low, breathe shallow, and watch your step. She turned the corner and felt a bizarre mix of relief and sorrow at the sight of the burning wreckage right in front of her. She bobbed her head and took a small breath through the fabric of her vest, feeling her skin flush and tighten from the heat. The fire wasn't as bad as she'd feared, more smoke than substance, and not much taller or bigger than she was. The flame that licked up the wall in the orange-yellow yellow fingers seemed to be having trouble catching, stopped by the heavy wooden fabric of a half-smashed door. It was the nose of the helicopter that drew her attention, the blackened shell of the smoldering cockpit, and the blackened husk of the pilot that's still strapped to the seat, the melted mouth frozen in a yawning, silent scream. There was no way to tell if it had been a man or a woman. The features had been obliterated, running together like dark tallow. What the hell is tallow, I wonder? I've never heard that word before. Well, I can look it up later. Claire jerked the metal pin loose from the handle and aimed the hose at the burning floorboards, where the flame danced in white and blue. She squeezed the lever down, and the hissing plume of snowy spray whooshed out, blasting over the debris in a powdery cloud. Barely able to see through the billowing whiteness, she directed the hose over everything, dousing the wreckage liberally with the oxygen killer. Within a minute, the fire appeared to be out, but she kept up with the extinguisher until it ran dry. At the last sputtering coughs of spray, Claire let go of the handle and took a few more shallow breaths, inspecting the smoking wreck for any spots she missed. Not a flicker, but the wooden door alongside the helicopter's flocked cockpit was still leaking tendrils of black smoke. She leaned closer and saw a tinge of glowing orange underneath the charred surface. The area surrounding the burning wood had already been touched, but she didn't want to take any chances. She stepped back and gave the door a solid kick, aiming at the glowing embers. Her boot connected squarely with the hot spot, and the door flew open in a splintering crack, the scorched wood giving way in a spark of showers and cinders. A few landed on her bare calf, but she drew her weapon before stopping to brush them off, more afraid of what it might be waiting for her in the ruined door than a few blisters. A short, empty hallway littered with jagged pieces of splintered wood and hazy smoke, then a door at the end on the left. Claire moved towards it, as much as to get some fresh air to see where it led. With the immediate threat of the fire over, she had started to look for Leon, and thinking about what they need to survive. If she could check out a few of the rooms along the way, maybe she'd be able to find stuff they could use. A phone that works, car keys, hell, a couple of machine guns or a flamethrower would be nice, but I'll take what I can get. The plane door at the end of the hall was unlocked. Claire pushed it open, ready to fire at anything that moved, and stopped, feeling mildly shocked by the bizarre atmosphere of the lavish room. It was like some kind of parody of a men's club from the 50s, a large office decorated with an extravagance that bordered on ridiculous. The walls were lined with heavy mahogany bookshelves and matching tables that surrounding a kind of sitting area that made up of padded leather chairs and a low marble table, all set atop an obviously expensive oriental rug. An elaborate chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a rich, mellow light over all of it. Framed pictures and delicate vases were situated throughout all of it. But their classic designs were were overwhelmed by the stuffed animal heads and poised lifeless birds that dominated the room, most gathered around a massive desk at the far side. Oh, Jesus! Laid out across the desk, like some kind of character from a gothic horror story, was a beautiful young woman in a flowing white gown, her guts ripped open to bloody shreds. The corpse was like a centerpiece, the dried and dusty animals that stared down at her with dead, glassy eyes. There was a falcon and what looked like to be an eagle, and their ratty wings spread in simulated flight, as well as a couple of mounted deer heads, and that of a nappy-furred moose. The effect was so creepy and surreal that for a moment Claire couldn't breathe. And when the high-backed chair behind the desk swiveled around, suddenly, she barely held back a shriek of surreptitious terror, half expecting to see some vision of dark, grinning death. It was only a man, but a man with a gun pointed at her. Twice in one night, what are the odds? For a second, neither of them moved, and then the man lowered his weapon, a sickly half-smile playing across his pudgy face. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, his voice oily and false as a bad politician's. "I thought you were another one of those zombies." He smoothed his bristly mustache with one thick finger as he spoke, and although Claire had never met him before, she suddenly knew who he was. Chris had bitched about him often enough. Fat, mustachioed, and as slick as a snake oil salesman. It's the police chief, Irons. He didn't look good. His cheeks flushed with high color, and his porcine eyes rimmed with pure, puffed white flesh. The way his gaze darted around the room was unsettling, as if he was in the grip of some kind of heavy paranoia. In fact, he looked unbalanced, like he wasn't all that connected to reality. "Are you Chief Irons?" she asked, trying to sound pleasantly respectful as she stepped closer to the desk. "Yes, that's me," he said smoothly. "And just who are you?" Before she could speak, Irons went on, confirming Claire's suspicion with what he said next, and with the bitter, petulant tone in which he said it. "No, don't bother telling me. It makes no difference. You'll end up like all the others." He trailed off, staring down the dead woman in front of him with some emotion that Claire couldn't place. She felt bad for him in spite of all that. Chris had told her about his rotten personality and professional incompetence. God knows what horrors he'd witnessed, or what he had to go through to survive. Is it any wonder that he's having trouble with reality? Leah and I wandered into this horror show at the last reel. Irons was here for the previews, which was probably included watching his friends die. She looked down at the young woman on the desk, and Irons spoke again, his voice somehow sad and pompous at the same time. "That's the mayor's daughter. I was supposed to look out for her, but I failed miserably." Claire searched for some words of comfort, wanting to tell him that he was lucky to have lived, and that it wasn't his fault, but as he continued his lament, the words died in her throat along with all of her pity. "Just look at her. She was a true beauty, her skin nothing short of perfection. But it will soon putrefy, and within the hour she'll become one of those things, just like all the others." Claire didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but the wistful longing in his tone and in his shining, hungry stare made her skin crawl. The way he was looking at the dead girl. "You're imagining things. He's the chief of police, not some perverted lunatic. He's the first person you've met who might be able to give you some kind of information. Don't waste the opportunity." "There must be some way to stop it," Claire said gently. "In a manner of speaking, a bullet to the brain or decapitation." He finally looked away from the body, but not at Claire. He turned to gaze at the stuffed creatures perched on the edge of his desk, his voice taking a resigned but somehow mirthful quality. "And to think, taxidermy used to be my hobby. No longer." Claire's internal alarms were doing some serious jangling. Taxidermy? What the hell did that have to do with the dead human being on his desk? Irons was finally looking at her, and Claire didn't like it one bit. His dark and beady gaze was directed at her face, but he didn't seem to actually see her at all. For the first time, it occurred to her that he hadn't asked her one question about how she'd come to be there, or commented on the smoke that had leaked into his office. And the way he talked about the mayor's daughter. No real sorrow at her passing, only self-pity and some kind of twisted admiration. Oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy. He's just one of the, he's not just out of touch here, he's on a different goddamn planet. Please, Iron said softly. I'd like to be alone now. He sagged down into his chair, closing his eyes, his head falling back against the padded back as if in exhaustion. As simply as that, she had been dismissed. And although she had millions of questions, many of which she thought he could provide the answer for, she did think that maybe it was for the best if she just got the hell away from him, at least for now. A soft creaking sound behind her and to the left, so quiet that she wasn't even sure she'd heard it at all. Claire turned, frowning, and saw that there was a second door to the office. She hadn't noticed it before. That soft, stealthy sound had come from behind it. Another zombie? Or maybe somebody hiding. She looked back at Irons and saw that he hadn't moved. Apparently he hadn't heard anything and had ceased to exist, and she'd ceased to exist for him, at least for the moment. He'd gone back to whatever private world he had been in before she'd stumbled into his office. So back the way I came, or do I see what's behind door number 2? Leon. She had to find Leon, and she had a pretty strong feeling that Irons was a creep, whether he was crazy or not. No great loss if he wasn't up for joining forces. But if there were other people hiding in this building, people that she and Leon could help, or who might be able to help them, it would only take a moment to check. With a last glance at Irons sagging next to the corpse of the mayor's daughter, and surrounded by his lifeless animals, Claire walked to the second door, hoping she wasn't making a mistake. Good comments are fun. we're bleeding subscribers here. Oh, not subscribers, watchers. If you guys could do me a favor and post this around, share it around that this is happening, I would very much be appreciative. Let me get another swig of this. My face looks a little bit better there. There we go. But I can't read like that, so I need this. Yeah. Okay. Chapter 11. Sherry had been hiding for a long time in the police station, for what must have been 3 or 4 days, and hadn't seen her mother yet. Not once, not even when there had still been a lot of people left. She'd found Mr. Addison right after she'd gotten there, one of the teachers from school, but Mr. Addison had died. Mrs. Addison. But Mrs. Addison had died. A zombie had eaten her. And not long after that, Sherry had found a ventilation shaft that ran over most of the building, most of the whole building, and had decided that hiding was safer than staying in the grown-ups. Because the adults kept dying, and because there was a monster in the station even worse than the zombies or the inside-out men, and she was pretty sure that the monster that was looking for her. That was probably stupid. She didn't think that the monsters picked out just one person to go for, but then again, she never thought that monsters were real either. So Sherry had stayed hidden, mostly in the night room. There weren't any dead people there, and the only way to get in besides the ventilation shaft was behind the suits of armor. And the only way to get in besides the ventilation shaft behind the suits of armor was to go down a long hallway guarded by a giant tiger. The tiger was stuffed, but it was still scary, and Sherry thought that maybe the tiger would scare away the monsters. Part of her knew that was dumb, but it made her feel better anyway. I'll say for better. Since the zombies had taken over everything in the police station, she spent a lot of time sleeping when she When she was asleep, she didn't have to think about what might happen next to her parents or to worry about what was going to happen to her. The air shaft was pretty warm, and she had plenty to eat from the candy machine downstairs. But she was scared, and even worse than being scared was being lonely. So mostly she just slept. She'd been asleep, warm and curled up behind the nights, when she'd been awakened by a tremendous crash somewhere outside. She was sure it was the monster. She'd only caught a glimpse of it once before, one of the giant's broad and terrible back, through a steel grate, but she'd heard it, screaming and howling through the building many times since then. She knew it was terrible. She knew that it was a terrible, terrible, and violent hungry. Fuck, that is a strange sentence. She knew it was terrible, terrible, and violent and hungry. Sometimes it disappeared for hours at a time, letting her hope that it had given up. But it always came back, and no matter where Sherry was, it always seemed to appear somewhere close by. The loud noise had ripped her from her dreamless sleep. Was like the sound of the monster would make tearing at the walls, and she huddled in her hiding place, ready to dart back into the shaft if the sound came any closer. It didn't. For a long time she didn't move, waiting with her eyes squeezed shut, holding on to her good luck charm, a beautiful gold pendant that her mother had given her only last week, so big that it filled up her whole hand. As it had before, the charm worked. The loud, terrible noise hadn't been repeated. Or maybe the tiger had kept the monster from finding her. Either way, when she had heard a gentle thumping sound in the office, she felt safe enough to creep out of the case and go into the hall to listen. The zombies and inside-out men couldn't use doors, and if it was the monster, it would have come for her already, clawing down doors and screaming for blood. It has to be a person. Maybe Mom? Halfway down the hall, where it turned right, she heard people talking in the office and felt a burst of hope and loneliness mixed together. She couldn't tell what they were saying, but it was the first time she'd heard anybody who wasn't yelling for maybe 2 days. And if there were people talking, maybe it was because she had help had finally come to Raccoon. The army, or the government, or the Marines, or maybe all of them. Excited, she hurried down the hall and was next to the big snarling tiger, right by the door, when her excitement faltered. The voices had stopped. Sherry stood still, suddenly anxious. If people had come to Raccoon to help, wouldn't she have heard the planes and trucks? Wouldn't there be shooting and bombs and men with loudspeakers telling everyone to come out? Maybe those voices aren't army people at all. Maybe those voices are bad people, crazy like that one man. Not long after Sherry had gone into hiding, she seen a terrible thing through a grate that led her into the locker room. A tall man with red hair had been in the room, talking to himself and rocking back and forth in a chair. At first, Sherry had thought about asking him for help to find her parents, but something about the way he was talking and giggling and gently swaying back and forth made her wary, so she watched him for a while from the safe darkness of the air shaft. He'd been holding a big knife, and after a long time, still laughing and mumbling and rocking, he stabbed himself in the stomach. Sherry had been more scared by that man than the zombies, because it didn't make sense. He'd been crazy, and he'd killed himself, and she'd crawled away crying because it just didn't make any sense. She didn't want to meet anyone else like that, and if the people in the office were okay, they might take her away from her safe place and try to protect her, and that would mean her death because the monsters surely weren't afraid of the adults. It felt awful to turn away, but there was no other choice. Sherry started back for the armor room. Creak! And froze as the door shifted underfoot. The floor shifted underfoot. The sound of the creaking board seemed incredibly loud, and she held her breath, clutching her pendant and praying that the door wouldn't come flying open behind her, that some crazy wouldn't charge in and get her. She didn't hear anything, but felt sure that the pounding of her heart would give her away. It was so loud. After a full 10 seconds, she carefully started back down the hall, stepping as lightly as she could, feeling like she was creeping out of a cave filled with sleeping snakes. The hall back to the armor room seemed like it was a mile long, and she had to use all of her willpower not to run once she reached the turn. But if there was one thing she learned from all the movies and TV, it was that running from danger always meant horrible death. When she finally reached the entrance back to the armor room, she felt like she might just collapse from relief. She was safe again, and she could snuggle back into the old blankets that Mrs. Addison had found for her, and just... The door from the office opened and closed, and the second later there were footsteps coming for her. Sherry flew into the armor room, no longer thinking about anything at all in the bright and trembling crush of panic that had swept through her. She sprinted past the three knights, forgetting her safe place because all she knew that she had to get away, get as far away as possible. There was a dark, tiny chamber past the glass in the middle of the room, and darkness was what she needed, a shadow to disappear into. And she could hear the running footsteps coming, footsteps somewhere behind her, pounding over wood as she hurtled into the dark room and into the farthest corner. Sherry crouched down between the dusty bricks of the room's fireplace and padded chair beside it, and tried to make herself as small as possible, hugging her knees and hiding her face. Please, 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 don't come in, don't see me, I'm not here. The running footsteps had come into the armor room, and were slow now, hesitant, moving around the big glass case in the middle. Sherry thought her safe place, the mouth of the ventilation shaft that could have taken her away, and struggled to hold back hot tears of self-condemnation. The fireplace room had no escape. She was trapped. Each hollow thumping step brought the stranger closer to the dark room in which Sherry hid. She scrunched herself tighter, making promises that she would do anything at all if the stranger would go away. Thump, thump, thump. Suddenly the room flashed into blinding brightness. Brightening brightness. Suddenly the soft click of the light switch lost beneath Sherry's terrified cry. She pushed away from her corner and ran, screaming and unseen, hoping to get past the stranger and back to the air shaft. And a warm hand grabbed her arm tight, keeping her from going one more step. She screamed again, jerking as hard as she could, but the stranger was strong. Wait! It was a lady's voice that almost as frantic as Sherry's hammering heart. Oh! Thanks, LJ! Thanks for the donation, man. What does it say? I have no idea why I'm donating. Because you're a good person, LJ. You're a good kid. Let me go! Sherry wailed, but the lady was still holding on, even pulling her close. Easy, easy. I'm not a zombie. Take it easy. It's okay. The woman's voice had turned soothing, the words crooned gently. The hand on Sherry's wrist warmed and strong. The sweet musical voice repeated the gentle words again and again. Easy, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now. Sherry finally looked up at the lady and saw how pretty she was, how her eyes were soft with concern and sympathy. And just like that, Sherry stopped trying to get away and felt hot tears trickle down her face. Tears that she had been holding back ever since she had seen the red-haired man commit suicide. She instinctively hugged the young, pretty stranger, and the lady hugged her back, her slender arms tight across Sherry's trembling shoulders. Sherry cried for a couple of minutes, letting the woman stroke her hair and whisper some soothing words to her. And at last, she felt like the worst was over. As much as she wanted to crawl into the lady's arms and forget all of her fears, to believe that she was safe, she knew better. And besides, she wasn't a baby anymore. She turned 12 just last month. With an effort, Sherry stepped back away from the woman and wiped her eyes, looking up into her pretty face. They're really harping on how Sherry thinks that Claire is pretty. The woman wasn't that old, maybe only 20 or so, and was dressed really cool. Boots and cut-off pink denim shorts with a matching vest and no sleeves. She wore a shiny brown hair in a ponytail, and when she smiled, she looked like a movie star. The woman crouched down right in front of her, still smiling gently. "My name's Claire. What's yours?" Sherry felt shy suddenly, embarrassed for running and then trying to get away from such a nice lady. Her parents had often told her that she acted like an emotional baby, and that she was too imaginative for her own good. And here was the proof. Claire wasn't going to hurt her, she could tell. "Sherry Birkin," she said, and smiled at Claire, hoping that Claire wasn't mad at her. She didn't look mad, in fact, she looked pleased with Sherry's answer. "Do you know where your parents are?" Claire asked, in the same sweet tone. "They work at the Umbrella chemical plant just outside of town," Sherry said. "Chemical plant? Then what are you doing here?" "My mom called and told me to go to the police station. She said it was too dangerous to stay at home." Claire nodded. From the looks of things, she was probably right, but it's dangerous here as well. Claire frowned thoughtfully, then smiled again. You better come with me. Sherry felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, and shook her head, wondering how to explain to Claire that it wasn't a good idea, that it was a very bad idea. She wanted more than anything to not be alone anymore, but it just wasn't safe. If I go with her and the monster finds us, Claire would be killed. And although Claire was thin, Sherry was pretty sure that she wouldn't be able to fit in the ventilation shaft. "There's something out there," she said finally. "I saw it. It's bigger than the zombies, and it's coming after me." There's something about, Claire shook her head, opening her mouth to say something, probably to try and talk her into changing her mind, when a terrible, furious sound filled the room, echoing in violent waves from somewhere in the building, somewhere close. Sherry felt cold, her blood turn to ice. Claire's eyes went wide, her skin paling. What was that? Sherry backed away, breathless, in her mind already running for the safe place behind the 3 suits of armor. "That's what I was telling you," she gasped out, and before Claire could stop her, she turned and ran. "Sherry!" Sherry ignored the shouted plea, sprinting past the glass exhibit case for the safety of the air shaft. She leapt nimbly over the knight's pedestal and dropped to her hands and knees, ducking her head and scrambling to the ancient stone hole set into the base of the wall. Her only chance, Claire's only chance, was for Sherry to get as far away from her as possible. Maybe they would find each other again when the monster had gone. As Sherry crawled back quickly through the tight and winding darkness, she hoped it wasn't already too late. Was the chemical plant in danger during this? Well, we'll soon find out. Ada sat on the edge of the cluttered desk in the office of the chief of detectives, resting her aching feet and staring blankly at the empty steel safe in the corner. Her patience was wearing thin. Not only was the G-virus sample nowhere to be found, she was starting to think that Bertolucci had flown the coop. She'd gone through the break room, the star's office, the library. In fact, she was pretty sure she covered just about everywhere the reporter would have easy access to, and had used 2 full clips to do it. Magazines! It wasn't that she was low on ammo. It was the waste of time that the bullets represented. 26 rounds and no results except that there had been a dozen more virus-riddled corpses lying around. and two of Umbrella's freak hybrids. Ada shuddered, remembering the warped red flesh and trumpeting shrieks of the bizarre creatures that she capped in the press room. She'd never been particularly bothered by greed, corporate or otherwise, but Umbrella had been up to something seriously immoral some seriously immoral experimentation. Trent had warned her about the tyrant retrievers, which thankfully hadn't been put in appearance yet, but the long-tongued, clawed humanoids were an affront to even her sensibilities. Not to mention a lot harder to kill than the virus carriers. They were T-virus products. If they were T-virus products, she'd have to keep her fingers crossed that Birkin hadn't done anything with his newest creation. According to Trent, the G-series hadn't been put to use yet, but it was supposed to be twice as potent. Ada let her gaze wander, taking in the plain functional office. It wasn't the most inspiring environment to take a break in, but at least it was reasonably gore-free with the door closed. With the door closed, she could hardly smell the officers in the main part of the room. They'd been pretty far gone when she put them down, that boneless wet stage that apparently preceded total collapse. Not that it matters if I can still smell them. My hair and my clothes have absorbed the goddamn smell. When they started to go bad, it seemed to happen with a bang. She wished she'd bothered to learn more on the science end. She knew what the T-virus was used for, but hadn't thought it necessary to research the physicochemical effects. Why bother when she had no reason to think that Umbrella had been planning to spill a shitload of it in their hometown? She was getting plenty of first-hand information about how well it worked, but it would have been nice to know exactly what happened in the infected party's body and mind that turned them from a person into a mindless flesh-eater. Instead, she could only file away her observations and make a guess at the truth. From what she'd seen, it took less than an hour for someone's infected to turn into a zombie. Sometimes the victim went into a kind of fever coma first, which presumably burnt out parts of the brain, and only added to the impression that they were waking from the dead when they stood up and started looking for meat. The symptoms of the virus were the same for everyone, but not the progression rate. She'd seen at least 3 cases where the victim had turned bloodthirsty, within a couple of moments of being infected. The stage she'd started to think as going cataract. One of the few constraints was that their eyes clouded with a thin film of edgy white mucus when they turned, and although the physical deterioration always started immediately, some fell to pieces much faster than others. Oh god, T-Series, the T... Oh, you're right, holy crap! You've broken the cone blade... Broken the cone. You've broke the code blade charge, you broke it. T-Series is just as infectious as the T-virus. She was on... She sighed... Where was I? And why are you thinking about it? Your job doesn't include finding a cure, does it? She sighed, bending over to rub her toes. True enough, still it was something to think about. Focusing on staying alive was tiring and all-encompassing work. She didn't have a chance to consider the subtleties of the circumstances while clearing out the corridors. She was on break and she needed to let her brain run around a bit, ponder a few of the more puzzling aspects. And there are about 1,000 to mull over. Trent, what Bertolucci should or shouldn't know, and the stars. What the hell had happened to that merry crew? Actually, more like, what the hell had happened to that merry crew? From the articles that Trent had included in the info packet, she knew that the star's suspension about the star's suspension, and considering what they've been investigating, it didn't take a genius to figure out that they've been railroaded by Umbrella for uncovering part of, if not all of their biological weapons operations. Umbrella had probably offed them by now, if they hadn't gone into hiding, and she had to wonder if Trent had played any part of the star's little misadventures, or if he had tried to contact them before or after. Now that he would have told her, Trent was an enigma, to be sure. She'd only had one actual meeting with him, although he contacted her several times prior to her leaving for Raccoon, mostly by phone, and although she'd always prided herself on the ability to read people, she knew absolutely nothing about where his interests lay, and why he wanted the G-Virus or what his gripe with Umbrella was about. It was obvious that he had some kind of inside connection. He knew too much about the company's workings. But if that was the case, why not just pick up his own goddamn sample and then quit? Hiring an outside agent with the act of someone trying to avoid the implications. Trying to avoid implication, but implication of what? Ours is not to question why. A good principle to live by. She also wasn't getting paid to figure out Trent. She doubted she would be able to, even if she was getting paid for it. She'd never met such a supremely self-controlled man as Mr. Trent, and in every interaction they had, she'd gotten the feeling that that he had been smiling inside, as if he knew some intensely pleasurable secret that no one else was privy to. And yet, somehow, he hadn't come across as arrogant or overblown. He was a cool one, his geniality so natural that she had been vaguely intimidated. She might not have been able to pick up on his motives, but she'd seen that calm humor before. It was the real face of the true power, of a man with a plan and the means to implement it. So has the spill upset his plans, whatever they are? Or was he prepared for this contingency? He may not have planned for it, but I can't imagine that caught unawares is anywhere in Trent's vocabulary. Ada leaned back, rolling her head tirelessly before pushing herself off the desk and stepping back into her uncomfortable shoes. Enough downtime. She couldn't spare her arches and pains more than a few minutes, and didn't expect to figure out much of anything while she was away until she was well away from Raccoon. She still had a couple of areas to check for the Berlucci before heading to the sewers, and she noticed that some of the first floor window barricades weren't as solid as she might have hoped. She didn't want to end up blocked out of a path by the new group of carriers from the outside. There were secret passages on the east side and holding cells downstairs past the parking garage. If she couldn't find him in either of those places, she'd have to assume he'd left the station and concentrate her efforts on obtaining the sample. She decided to try the basement first. It seemed unlikely that he'd stumbled across a hidden corridor, one of the hidden corridors. From what she'd read of his work, he wasn't a good enough reporter to find his own ass. And if he was hiding in or near the holding cell, she wouldn't have to spend any more time roaming the station, facing the inevitable invasion. The entrance to the sub-basement was downstairs, so barring any complications, she could head straight for the lab. Ada walked out of the office, wrinkled her nose at the fresh burst of rotting smell pushed at her by the lazily spinning ceiling fans. There had to be 7 or 8 bodies in the desk-filled room, all of them cops, and at least 3 of them she had shot had been fairly rank. And didn't I leave 5 carriers still walking around in here when I came through before? Ada pushed just outside the large and open room, looking back in the narrow connecting corridors that had led to the back stairs. Had there been 5? She knew she'd cap a couple of on her first visit. The rest had been too slow to hassle with. And she thought there had been 5 of them, and yet she'd only had to knock off 3 while she had returned for her impromptu break. There were 5. I may not be at peak, but I can still count. She wasn't in the habit of doubting her abilities to keep track of such things, and the fact that she'd only just noticed was a sign of how tired she was. 2 days ago, she would have made the observation immediately. There was no way to tell if the additional corpses had been shot or had simply disintegrated on their own without exposing herself to contact. They were too messed up, but it would be wisest to assume that there are still a few survivors wandering around. Not for long, one way or another. Whether or not the zombies managed to break through, Umbrella would act soon if they hadn't already. What had happened in Raccoon was the shareholders' worst nightmare, and Umbrella certainly wasn't going to ignore the problem. They probably had already worked up a fail-safe disaster and prepared their own spin to feed the press. Ah. Where was I? And it was the foregoing conclusion that they had been trying to salvage Birkin's synthesis before putting their failsafe into effect, which meant that she'd have to be very careful. Birkin had apparently been somewhat secretive about his work, and Trent had relayed that Umbrella would eventually send a retrieval team. With Raccoon and Ashes, that eventuality had become moved forward a few notches. A team of human beings, hopefully. I can handle that. A tyrant, though, I don't need that kind of pain. Ada turned away from the room, walking towards the closed door that would lead her to the basement steps. Tyrant was a code name for a particular series of in Umbrella's organic weapon research, a series that embodied the most destructive applications of the T virus. According to Trent, the White Umbrella scientists, the ones working in the secret labs, had just started tests on some kind of humanoid bloodhound designed to hunt down any assigned scent or substance. It had been encoded with relentless and inhumane capabilities. A tyrant retriever, a nearly indestructible construct of infected flesh and surgically implanted wiring, just the kind of thing that they might send to find, say, a sample of the G virus. Once she collected Trent's samples, she was history, paid and drinking margaritas on a beach somewhere, and anything she might or might not feel about it, about how many innocents had just died, or what Trent wanted with the G virus for. It was just one more thing to put on her list of things the job did not call for. Her defenses safely in place, Ada started for the basement to see what could, see if she could find the troublesome reporter. Leon stood in the ramshackle basement weapons locker, adjusting the holster strap and thinking about where Claire might be. From what little he had seen so far, the station wasn't too bad. Cold and dim and stinking with the bodies heaped in the hallways, but not as actively dangerous as the streets. It wasn't much to be grateful for, but he had taken what he could get. He killed 2 of his fellow officers and a woman in the tatters of traffic patrol uniform on his way to the basement. The cops upstairs and the woman just outside the morgue, a few yards from the small room that housed the RPD armament. Only 3 zombies since he had reached the station, not including the few he'd been able to avoid in the detective rooms. But he passed over a dozen corpses on the short journey and had been able to make out the bullet holes on about half of them, through their eyes and directly to the temple. Between the cleanly dispatched creatures and the number of weapons missing from the lockers, he dared to hope that Branagh had been right about there being survivors. Marvin Branagh. Probably dead by now. Does that mean he'll turn into a zombie? If Umbrella really is behind all this, it has to be some kind of plague or disease. They're a pharmaceutical company, so how do you catch it? Is it a contact thing, or can you get it from taking a deep breath? Leon dropped that train of thought fast. As cool and humid as the basement was, the thought that he could be infected by the zombie sickness made him break out into a sudden feverish sweat. What if all of Raccoon was still hot, and he caught it just by driving into town? The cluttered shelves of the storage room seemed to close in just a bit, in anxiety a flash of epic proportions. But before real panic set in, he heard his mind's voice and reminded him of the reality, and the acceptance of the reality came with it, allowing him to let go of the fear. If you're sick, you're sick. You can eat a bullet before it gets bad. If you're not sick, maybe you can survive to tell your grandkids about all this. Either way, there's probably nothing you can do about it now, except to try to be a cop. Leon nodded to himself, sighing. A better plan was than worrying about it, and he now had the equipment to boost his chances. The electronic lock for the weapons store had been shot through, saving him from having to search for a key card or shooting it himself. The door had obviously been pried open, the external locks and handle practically shredded. On his first dig through the room, he had been disappointed, and not a little freaked. There had been no handguns at all, and very little ammo left in the dedented green lockers. But he had found a box of shotgun shells, and after a second, more desperate thoroughly search, he had uncovered a 12-gauge hidden behind a high stack of boxes. There were a couple of shoulder harnesses from the Remnant model still hanging on the wall, as well as a bigger utility belt than the one he already wore. It even had a side back deep enough to hold all of the loaded magnum clips. With a final cinch on the kinch on the harness, he decided that it would be best to start searching for the most obvious places first. Every connecting corridor from every possible entrance. He'd head back to the lobby first and find something to leave a note on. Bam! 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 Shots fired, close, and the echoing tone of it was the garage just down the hall. Leon yanked the magnum out and ran for the door. Precious seconds waited as he fumbled for the mangled handle. The hall was clear except for the dead traffic cop on the floor to his right. Straight ahead was the entrance to the parking garage, and Leon hurried towards it, reminding himself that he wanted to go in easy, that he didn't want to get shot by a panicked gunman. Take it slow, get a good look before you move, identify yourself clearly. The door set into the wall to his right was standing open, and as Leon darted a look into the wide and open space, his body shielded by the concrete block wall, he saw something that startled him into forgetting about the shooter. The dog. It's the same goddamn dog. Impossible, but the sprawled, lifeless animal in the middle of the car-lined chamber looked the same. Even the barest glimpse he had before, the slimy, wet demon in canine form that had nearly scared him into a crash 10 miles outside of the city, could have come from the same litter. Beneath the sputtering fluorescent strips that had lit the cold, oil-stained garage, Leon could see how truly abnormal it was. There didn't seem to be anything moving, and no sound except for the buzz of light. Still holding the magnum ready, Leon stepped into the garage, determined to get a closer look at the creature, and saw a second one in the park next to a parked squad car, apparently just as dead as the first. Both lay in sticky red pools of their own blood, their long, skinned-looking limbs splayed out brokenly. Umbrella. The wild animal attacks, the disease. How long has this shit been going on? And how did they manage to keep it quiet with all those murders? What was even more confusing is why Raccoon wasn't crawling with support services already. Umbrella may have been able to keep their involvement with cannibal murders silent, but how could they keep Raccoon citizens from calling for help from outside the city? And these dogs, like carbon copies, something else that Umbrella made up in their labs? He took another step toward the fallen dog things, frowning, not liking the dark conspiracy theories that were forming in his thoughts, but able to ignore them. Let me see how far. Okay, we're almost the next chapter. But able to ignore them. What he liked even less was a look of oil stains in the concrete floor. They were rust-colored, and there were too many of the dried splotches for him to count. He bent down to get a closer look, intent on putting the rest of the terrible suspicion that he didn't register the shot until he heard the high singing whine when it blew past his head. Bam! Leon spun, bringing the magnum up, shouldering it at the same time. Hold your fire! And saw the shooter lowering her weapon, a woman in a short red dress and black leggings standing by a van at the far wall. She started walking towards him, her slender hips rolling smoothly, her head high and shoulders back, as if they were at a cocktail party. Leon felt a rush of anger that she would seem so calm after nearly killing him, but as she got closer, he found himself wanting to forgive her. She was beautiful and wore an expression of genuine pleasure at seeing him, a welcome sight after so much death. Sorry about that, she said. When I saw the uniform, I thought you were another zombie. She was Asian American, fine-boned but tall, and her short hair was thick and glossy black. Her deep, satiny voice was almost pure, a strange contrast to the way she looked at him. The slight smile she wore didn't seem to touch her almond-shaped eyes, which were scrutinizing him carefully. Who are you? Ada? Ada Wong. The throaty purr again. She tilted that throaty purr again. She tilted her head back, still smiling. I'm Leon Kennedy, he said reflexively, not sure what to ask where to start. What are you doing down here? Ada nodded towards the van behind him, an RPD transport wagon that had been blocking the holding cell area. I came to Raccoon looking for a reporter named Bertolucci, and I have reason to think that he's in one of these cells, and I think he might be able to help me find my boyfriend. Her smile faded, her sharp, almost electric gaze meeting his. And I think he knows about what happened here. Would you help me move that van? If there was a reporter locked up in one of the other side of the garage wall who could tell them anything at all, Leon was eager to meet him. He wasn't sure what to make of Ada's story, but couldn't imagine why she would lie about anything. The station wasn't safe, and she was looking for survivors just like he was. Yeah, okay, he said, feeling caught off guard by her smoothly direct manner. It felt like she had taken control of their meeting, some subtle but deliberate manipulation that put her in charge. And from the casual way she turned and walked back to the van, as if there was no question that he would follow, he thought she knew it. Don't be paranoid. Strong women do exist. The more people we can find, the more help I can get to look for Claire. Maybe it was time to stop making plans and just try to keep up. Leon holstered the Magnum and went after her, hoping that the reporter was where Ada thought he was, and that things would start making sense sooner rather than later. All right, 1 minute, guys. I'm going to take a brief break to get a glass of water and close the blinds here. I need to finish this. Be right back. Good on my throat.
Oops. That's not good.
Okay. How's everyone doing? Everyone having fun? Everyone enjoying the read? Alright, let's get back to it. Chapter 13. Sherry Birkin was gone, and Claire couldn't fit herself into the ventilation duct to go after her. Whoever had screamed and scared the little girl so badly hadn't put in an appearance, but Sherry was history, maybe still crawling frantically through some dark and dusty tunnel. She had apparently been hiding by the duct for a while. There were empty candy bar wrappers and a musty old blanket stuffed in the opening, the pathetic little hideaway tucked behind 3 standing suits of armor. Once she realized that Sherry wasn't coming back, Claire had hurried back to Irons' office, hoping that he might be able to tell her where the duct led out. But Irons was gone, along with the body of the mayor's daughter. Claire stood in the office, watched over by the dumb glassy eyes of the morbid decor, and felt really uncertain for the first time since she hit town. She started out to find Chris, a goal that had expanded to include worries about zombies dodging and hooking up with Leon, and avoiding creepy Chief Irons, pretty much in that order. But in the few moments between meeting the little girl and that strange howling scream, her priorities had shifted dramatically. A child was caught up in this nightmare, a sweet little kid who believed that there was a monster stalking her. Maybe there is. If I can accept that raccoons got zombies, why not monsters? Hell, why not vampires or killer robots? Oh, hey, Fallen Knight. Luca, I have a full review of the RE2 remake up on my channel. She wanted to find Sherry, and didn't know how to start. She wanted her big brother, but was just as clueless as to where he might be, and she had begun to wonder if he knew anything about what had happened in Raccoon. The last time she talked to him, he avoided her questions about why the stars had been suspended, insisting that it wasn't anything to worry about, that he and the team had run into some political troubles in the office and it was all going to be sorted out. She was used to his protectiveness, but thinking back, hadn't he seemed overly evasive? And the stars had been investigating the cannibal murders. It wasn't much of a stretch to connect the past flesh-eating activities with the current. Which means what? That Chris uncovered some evil plot and was hiding it? She didn't know. All she knew was that she didn't believe that he was dead, and that for now, finding Chris or Leon would have to take a back seat to finding Sherry. As bad as things were, Claire had defenses. She had a gun, and she had at least a little emotional maturity. And after nearly 2 years of daily 5-mile runs, she was in excellent shape. But Sherry Birkin couldn't be older than 11 or 12, and seemed frail in every sense of the word, from the dirt in her pixie blonde hair to the desperate anxiety in her worried blue eyes. She had inspired all of Claire's protective instincts. Thump! A heavy, hollow vibration rattled through the ceiling, making the intricate chandelier in Iron's office tremble. Claire reflexively looked up, gripping her handgun. There was nothing to see but wood and plaster, and the sound didn't repeat itself. Something on the roof? But what could have made a noise like that? An elephant being airdropped? Maybe it was Sherry's monster. The vicious scream they heard back in the private exhibit room had come from a duct through a duct door to the fireplace. The origin of the cry impossible to pin down. But it could have been the roof. Claire wasn't particularly keen on meeting up with whatever had screamed, but Sherry had seemed certain the creature was following her. So find the screamer, find the girl? Not my idea of a perfect plan, but I don't have much else to go on at this point. It might be the only way to find her. Or maybe it was Irons up there, and although her meeting with him had left a slimy taste in her mouth, she regretted not having tried to get more information out of him. Crazy or not, he hadn't struck her as stupid. It might not be a bad idea to find him again, at least. To ask some questions about some of the ventilation system. She wouldn't know anything until she checked it out. Claire turned and went down to the office door that had opened to the outer corridor, where she put out the helicopter's fire. The smoke had thinned in the adjoining hall, and although the air was still warm, it wasn't the heat of the fresh blaze. In that, at least, she'd been successful. Claire stepped back into the main hall, averting her eyes from what was left of the pilot, and crack! She froze and heard a massive splintering of wood, followed by a thick, ponderous steps of someone who must be huge, moving through the corridor, past the turn. The sound deliberate and thundering. Guy must weigh a ton, and oh Jesus, tell me that wasn't a door being torn apart. Claire shot a look back down the small hallway to the Irons office, and her instincts telling her to run, her brain reminding her that it was a dead end, her body paralyzed between the two. And the biggest man she'd ever seen stepped into view, shadowed by the thin haze of smoke drifting through the hall. He was dressed in a long army green overcoat that accented his size, and was as tall as an NBA star. Taller, but with a proportionate bulk. A thick utility belt was wrapped around his waist, and though she couldn't see any weapons, she could feel the violence radiating off of him in invisible waves. She could just make out his sickly white blur of a face, the hairless sloping skull, and quite suddenly Claire was certain that he was a monster, a killer with black-gloved fists, each as big as a human head. Shoot! Shoot it! Claire aimed but hesitated, terrified of making the horrible mistake. Until it took one massive step towards her on a tree trunk legs, and she heard the crunch of denting wood beneath its booted Frankenstein feet. She saw black eyes, black and rimmed with red, like lava pits filled with misshapen white boulder. Blank, but not at all blind, his gaze found hers, and he raised one meaty clenched fist, the threat unmistakable. Shoot, 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 shoot! She squeezed the trigger, 1, 2 times, and saw the impact. A flap of its lapel blew into shreds, just below its collarbone. The second shot slicing cleanly through one side of its neck. And he took another step, not a flicker of expression passing over the rough hewn features. The fist still raised, seeking a target, seeking to crush. The black smoking hole in its throat wasn't bleeding. Oh shit! In a rush of adrenaline-boosted dread, Claire pointed the handgun at the creature's heart and pulled the trigger repeatedly, the giant taking another step, striding into the stream of explosive fire without flinching. And she lost track of the shots, unable to believe that it could still be coming. Less than 10 feet away as the rounds hammered into the mammoth's chest, and the gun clicked empty, even as the monster stopped in its thundering tracks, swaying from side to side like a tall building in a high wind. Without taking her shocked gaze from the reeling giant, Claire grabbed another clip from her vest and fumbled through reloading her brain, crazily trying to name this walking abomination. This walking abortion. Terminator, Frankenstein's monster, Dr. Evil, Mr. X, whatever it was supposed to be, the 7 plus semi-jacketed rounds into the chest had finally taken effect. Silently, the towering creature slumped to the right, falling heavily against one smoke-blackened wall, and sagging there, not crumpling, but still not moving either. Weird angle, that's all. He's dead, just propped up by his own weight. Claire didn't move any closer, keeping the handgun leveled at the motionless giant. Was this the screamer? For as powerful and inhuman as it looked, she didn't think so. This was no primal furious demon howling for blood. Mr. X was more like a soulless machine, bloodless flesh that could ignore pain, or embrace it. Dead now, doesn't matter, Claire whispered, as much as to reassure herself as to cut the relentless stream of useless thoughts. She had to think, to figure out what this meant. This wasn't some freak zombie mutation, so what the hell was it? Why didn't it fall down? She'd emptied a mostly full clip. Would somebody hear the shots? Would Sherry or Irons or Leon or whoever else be lurking around the station come find her? Should she stay where she was? The creature that had already started to think of as Mr. X wasn't breathing, its muscular body perfectly still, its face as close to death. Claire bit her lower lip, staring at the still impossibly standing, leaning creature, trying to think through her confused fear. And saw his eyes open, his shiny black and red eyes. Without so much as a wince of pain or effort, Mr. X swayed back to a stand, blocking the hull, his giant hands raising again, and with a mighty swing he crashed his fist through the air, his long arm sweeping just in front of her as she stumbled back. The momentum was enough for both his huge hands to plunge into the wall across from where he leaned. The impact buried his fist, his arm stuck in the wood and plaster halfway up to his elbows. Me. Could have been me. Back through Iron's office, she'd already been trapped. Back through Iron's office, and she'd be trapped. Without giving the matter any further thought, Claire moved, sprinting towards Mr. X. She flew past him, her right arm actually brushing against his heavy coat, her heart skipping a beat as the material wiped across her skin. She ran, hung a left, and dashed down the lazy hall, trying to remember what was past the waiting room, trying not to hear the unmistakable sounds of movement just behind as Mr. X jerked his hands free. Jesus, what is that thing? Back through the waiting room, slamming the door behind her as she ran. Claire decided that she would decide later. She ran, not letting herself think anything at all but how to run faster. Ben Bertolucci was in the last cell of the room, farthest from the garage, crashed out on a metal cot and snoring lightly. Keeping her expression carefully neutral, Ada decided to let Leon wake him up. She didn't want to seem overly eager, and if that there was one thing that she knew about men, it was like they were easier to handle when they thought they were in control. Ada looked up at Leon with patience and with a patience she didn't feel, and waited. They checked out the empty kennel and a winding concrete hall before finding him, and though the cold, dank air reeked of blood and virus decay, they hadn't come across any bodies, which was strange considering the slaughter that Ada knew had occurred in the dank garage. She thought about asking Leon if he knew what had happened, but had decided that the less they spoke, the better. There was no point in letting him get used to having her around. She'd seen the manhole in the kennel rusting and set into the dark corner, and had been gratified to see a crowbar on an open shelf nearby. With Bertolucci snoozing in front of them, Ada felt like things were finally starting to pick up. "Let me guess," Leon said loudly, and reached out to thump on the metal bars with the butt of his gun. "You must be Bertolucci, right? Get up, now!" Bertolucci groaned and sat up, slowly rubbing at his stubbled jaw. Ada wanted to smile, watching him frown warily in their direction. He looked like shit. His clothes rumpled, his lanky ponytail frazzled. Still wearing his tie, though. Poor slob probably thinks it makes him look more like a real reporter. "What do you want? I'm trying to sleep here." He sounded grouchy again, and Ada had to suppress a smile. It served him right for being so difficult to find. Leon glanced at Ada, looking at a trifle uncertain. "Is this the guy?" She nodded, realizing that Leon probably thought Bertolucci was a prisoner. The conversation would dispel that particular notion fast, but she didn't want Leon to know more than he had to. She had to choose her words carefully. "Ben," she said, letting her voice carry a hint of desperation, "you told the city officials that you knew something about what was going on, didn't you? What did you tell them?" Bertolucci stood and glared at her, his lips curling. "And who the hell are you?" Pretending that she hadn't heard, Ada upped her desperation, but just a hair. She didn't want to overplay the helpless female bit. It kind of clashed with the fact that she'd survived this long. "I'm trying to find a friend of mine, John Howe. He was working for a branch of Umbrella based in Chicago, but he disappeared several months ago, and I heard rumor that he was here in the city." She trailed off, watching Bertolucci's expression. He knew something, no question, but she didn't think he was going to give up. "I don't know anything," he said gruffly. "And if I did, why would I want to tell you?" "Original. If the cop wasn't here, I'd probably just shoot him." Actually, she probably wouldn't. Ada wasn't into killing for the fun of it, and though she probably could get it out of him using one of her more persuasive methods, if her feminine charms didn't work, there was always the shots in the kneecaps. Unfortunately, she couldn't do anything with Officer Leon hanging around. She hadn't planned on this encounter, but for the moment she was stuck with it. The cop obviously wasn't happy with the reporter's responses. "Okay, I say we leave him in there," he growled, talking to Ada but staring at Bertolucci with undisguised irritation. Bertolucci half smiled, reached into one pocket, and pulled out the silver set of cell keys on a thick ring. Ada wasn't surprised, but Leon looked even more pissed off. "Fine by me," Bertolucci said smugly. "I'm not about to leave this cell anyway. It's the safest place in the building. There are more than just zombies running around, believe you me." How many chapters does this book have? The book has, I want to say 34? 32 plus epilogue. From the way you said it, Ada thought she'd probably have to kill him after all. Trent's instructions had been clear. If Bertolucci knew anything about Birkin's work on the G-Virus, he would be disposed of. Why, exactly, she wasn't sure, but that was the job. If she could just get a few moments alone with him, she'd be able to ascertain how much he actually knew. The question was, how? She didn't want to shoot Leon. As a rule, she didn't kill innocents. And besides, she liked cops. Not necessarily the brightest lot, but anyone who took the job that required putting his or her life on the line had to have respect. And he had a great taste in weaponry. The Desert Eagle was top of the line. So why rationalize? I ditch him first, then circle back, and doesn't mean I'm going soft. A violent, inhuman shriek pierced the tense silence. Ada snapped her Beretta around, aiming it at the open gate that led back through the empty cell block area. Whatever it was somewhere in the basement. What was that? Leon breathed from behind her. And Ada wished she knew the answer. The still resonating echo of the furious scream was like nothing she had ever heard before, and nothing she expected to hear, even knowing about Umbrella's research. Like I said, I'm not leaving this cell, Bertolucci said, his voice breaking slightly. Now get out of here before you lead it right to me. Sniveling coward. Look, I might be the only cop left alive in this building, Leon said, and something about his combination of fear and strength in his tone made Ada shoot a look back at him. The officer's gaze was fixed on Bertolucci, his blue eyes sharp and unyielding. So if you want to live, you're going to have to come with us. Forget it, Bertolucci snapped. I'm staying here till the cavalry shows up, and if you're smart, you'll do the same thing. Leon shook his head. Leon shook his head. It could be days before anyone comes. Our best chance is to find a way out of Raccoon, and you heard the scream. Do you really want to get a visit from whatever made it? She was impressed. Some umbrella freak could be lurching its way towards them right now, and Leon was actually trying to save the reporter's worthless hide. I'll take the risk, said Bertolucci. And good luck trying to getting out. You're going to need it. The rumpled reporter stepped up to the bars, looking back and forth between them, running a hand over his greasy hair. Look, he said, his voice softening. There's a kennel in the back of the building with a manhole in it. You can get to the sewers from there. It probably is the fastest way out of the city. Ada sighed inwardly. Terrific. So much for her hidden route to the lab. If she dumped Leon now, it would take him about 5 minutes to find her. You can always kill him if it comes to that. Or you can get him lost in the sewers and come back for Bertolucci while he's still clearing the path for you. Unlike Bertolucci, she didn't want to run into whatever had screamed. And now that she knew what he was up, staying put, luring the cop away was the next logical step. The things I do to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Oh, Fallen Knight's leaving? Alright, see you, Fallen Knight, have a good one. Alright, I'm going to check it out, she said, and without waiting for Leon's response, she turned and sprinted for the gate. Ada! Ada, wait! Another disappointment about the remake. Leon never says, Ada, wait! Which is like his catchphrase in the freaking game. So disappointing. It's almost like they never played Resident Evil 2. Okay. She ignored him, hurrying past the empty cells and back into the chilled hall, relieved that the passage was still clear, and feeling a little unnerved by her sudden reluctance to simplify the situation. Things would be a lot easier if she just got rid of them both, a decision she wouldn't have hesitated to make under different circumstances. But she was sick of death, sick and tired and disgusted with Umbrella for what they'd done, and she wasn't going to take the cop out unless she had to. And if she did have to, if it came down to some innocent's life or completing the job, that she could ask herself that question at all told her more about her state of mind than what she wanted to admit. She'd reached the door to the kennel. Ada took a deep breath, forcing every twinge of nagging emotion from her thoughts, and stepped inside to wait for Leon S. Kennedy. Let's see, how many pages do we have left in this? So about 22 pages. No, 32 pages. I think we'll get to the end of chapter 14 and then call it quits instead of going 32 pages. I think Instead, just going and, yeah, going 14 pages is probably way easier. And probably going to be better for this. Chapter 14. We're back with Blade Shard's favorite character. So beautiful. Even in death, Beverly Harris was radiant. But Irons couldn't risk having her wake up while he wasn't watching. He carefully folded her into the stone cabinet beneath the sink and latched it, promising himself that he would take her out when he had more time. She would become the most exquisite animal he'd ever transformed, posed and forever perfect once he prepared the proper way. A dream come true. If I have time, if there's any time left. He knew he was feeling sorry for himself again, but there was no one else to commiserate with. No one to marvel at the sheer magnitude of all he suffered. He felt terrible, sad and angry and alone, but he also felt that things had finally become clear. He knew now that why he was being persecuted, and the awareness that gave him his focus. As pressing as the truth was, he was at least no longer lost. Umbrella. An umbrella conspires to destroy me, all along. Iron sat on the scarred, stained table in the sanctuary, his special private place, and wondered how long it would be before the young woman came for him. The one with the athletic body, the one who refused to tell him her name. In a way, she was responsible for his newfound clarity, an irony that he couldn't help but appreciate. It had been her sudden appearance that had provided him with the truth. She would find him, of course. She was an Umbrella spy, and Umbrella had obviously been watching him for quite some time. They probably had a list of everything he owned, volumes of psychological profile reports, even copies of his financial records. It all made sense now that he had some time to think about. He was the most powerful man in Raccoon, and Umbrella had designed his downfall, tailored each vicious backstab to cause him the most acute agony possible. Iron stared at his treasures, the tools and trophies on the shelves in front of him, but felt none of the pride they usually inspired. The polished bones were simply something to look at in his mind, as his mind worked to absorb Umbrella's treachery. Now, Blade Shards, you know you love Bright Irons. You absolutely love him. Years before, when he started to take money to turn a blind eye to the company's doings, things had been different. Then it had been a matter of politics and finding himself a niche in the power structure that really controlled Raccoon. And things had worked smoothly for a time. His career had progressed on schedule, he earned the respect of officials and citizens alike, and for the most part, his investments had paid off. Life had been good. Nah, you love him. Don't deny it. I'm kidding, Blade Charge. You know I know. And then there was Birkin. William Birkin and his neurotic wife and their brat daughter. After the Spencer estate spill, he'd almost convinced himself that the stars and the goddamn Captain Wesker had been responsible for all the trouble, but he could see now that it was really the arrival of Birkin and his family nearly half a year ago that had started the ball rolling. The destruction of the Spencer estate, the Spencer lab, had only hurried things along. Umbrella had probably started monitoring him the day he had the misfortune to meet Birkin. At first just watching, planting bugs and installing cameras. The spies would have come later. The Birkins had come to Raccoon so William could concentrate on developing a superior synthesis to the T-virus, based on the research being done at the Spencer lab. As quirky and unpleasant as William could sometimes be, Irons had liked him, right from the start. The male Birkin had been Umbrella's boy genius, but like Irons, he wasn't the type to brag about his position. William was a humble man, only interested in fulfilling his own potential. They'd both been too busy to have much of a friendship, but there had been a mutual respect between them. Irons had often felt that William looked up to him. And my mistake was to allow it. To allow my regard for him to cloud my instincts, to keep me from noticing that I was... Alright, sorry about that, folks. That was a... Yeah, my Streamlabs just crashed. So... Yeah, but luckily we're back. So where was I? Um, the loss of the Spencer lab meant sent some big ripples through Umbrella's hierarchy, and one day after the explosion, Irons had been approached by Annette Birkin with a message from her husband, a message and a request for a favor. Birkin had been worried that Umbrella was going to demand the new synthesis, the G-virus, before it was ready. Apparently, he'd been most dissatisfied with the application of his previous work, something about how Umbrella hadn't let him perfect the replication process. Irons couldn't remember exactly, and with Umbrella looking to recover from the financial blow to the Spencer loss, Birkin had been concerned that they might compromise the integrity of the untested virus. Through Annette, Birkin had asked for some assistance, and offered him a little extra incentive to keep things fair. For $100 grand, all Irons had to do was help keep the G-virus under wraps. In short, watch out for Umbrella spies and keep an eye on the surviving stars, making sure they didn't do any more discovering of Umbrella's research. That was it. $100,000, and I was already watching my city, and keeping tabs on that rebellious little pack of troublemakers. Easy money, and more to be made of it if everything went as planned. Except it was a trap, an Umbrella trap. Irons had walked right into it, and it was when Umbrella had started plotting against him, using their own information as they gathered to seal his fate. How else could things have gone wrong so quickly? The stars had disappeared the stars had disappeared, then Birkin, and before he'd even had a chance to assess the situation, the attacks had started up again. He barely had time to seal Raccoon off before everything had fallen to shit. And all because I was helping a friend, for the greater good of the company, no less. Tragic. Iron stood up and walked slowly around the cutting table, idly tracing dents and scars in the wood with his fingertips. Behind every mark was a story and a memory of accomplishment, but again he could take no comfort. The cool, quiet atmosphere of the sanctuary had always soothed him before. It was where he practiced his hobbies, where he was truly able to find himself, but it wasn't his anymore. Nothing was. Umbrella had taken it from him, just like they had taken his city. Was it so far-fetched to deduce that they had unleashed the virus to get at him, to rob him of his power, and then sent that scantily clad brown-haired girl to rub his nose in it? Why else was she so attractive? They knew his weaknesses, and were exploiting them, trying to keep him from retaining even a shred of dignity. And soon she'd come for me, maybe still playing dumb, still trying to seduce me with her helplessness. An Umbrella assassin, a spy, an exploiter, that's all she is, probably laughing at me behind that pretty face. Maybe the spill had been an accident. The last time they met, William Birkin had seemed unsteady, paranoid, and exhausted, and accidents happened even under the best of circumstances. But the rest was fact. There was no other explanation for how completely Irons had been ruined. That girl was coming to get him. She was from Umbrella, and she'd been sent to murder him. And she wouldn't stop there. Oh no, she'd find Beverly and defile her somehow, just to make certain that nothing he cared about was left. Irons looked around the small, softly lit room that had once been his, gazing wistfully at the well-used tools and furniture, the sweet, familiar smells of disinfectant and formaldehyde emanating from the rugged stone walls. My sanctuary. Mine. He picked up the handgun and lay on his special cutting table, the VP-70 that was still his, and felt a bitter smile curl at his lips. His life was over. He knew that now. His whole affair had started with Birkin and would end here, by his own hands, but not yet. The girl would come for him, and he would kill her before he said his final goodbyes to Beverly, before he admitted his defeat by taking a bullet. But he would see to it that she understood his suffering first. For every torture he endured, the girl would pay the bill, settled through his flesh and bone, as much pain as he could inflict. He was going to die, but not alone. And not without hearing the girl scream in agony, creating a voice for the death of his dreams, a voice so clear and true that the echoes would still reach back the black hearts of the company executives who had betrayed him. Okay. The STARS office was empty, cluttered and cold, and layered with dust, but Claire was reluctant to leave. After her stumbling, frightened flight through the body-strewn halls of the second floor, finding the place where her brother had spent his working days had left her feeling weak with relief. Mr. X hadn't followed her, and although she was still anxious to help Sherry and find Leon, she found herself lingering and afraid to step back into the lifeless halls, and hesitant to leave with the one place that felt like Chris. Where are you, big brother? What am I going to do? Zombies, fire, death, your weird Chief Irons, and that lost little girl? And just when I thought things couldn't get any more insane, I get face to face with the thing that would not fucking die, that freako that ends all freaks. How am I going to get through this? I added the fucking for the record there. She sat at Chris's desk, gazing at a small strip of black and white pictures that she'd found tucked in the bottom drawer. The 4 shots were of the 2 of them, grinning and making faces in a photo booth memento of the week they spent in New York last Christmas. Finding the strip had made her want to cry at first, all of the fear and confusion she'd been holding back finally surging to the front of the sight of his well-loved smile. But the longer she looked at him, and the 2 laughing and having a good time, the better she started to feel. Not happy or even okay, and no less afraid than what was to come. Just better, calmer, stronger. She loved him, and knew that wherever he was, he loved her back. And that if the 2 of them had been able to survive on loss of both of their parents, to build lives for themselves and share a silly Christmas vacation, in spite of having no real home to go to, they could cope with anything. She could cope. Can and will. I'm going to find Sherry and Leon and, God willing, my brother, and we're going to make it out of Raccoon. The truth was she didn't really have any choice, but she needed to go through the process of accepting her lack of options before she could act. She heard before that real bravery wasn't an absence of fear, it was accepting the fear and doing what was necessary. Doing what was necessary anyway. And that once she sat for a moment thinking about Chris, she thought that she could do just that. Claire took a deep breath, slipped the photos into her vest, and pushed away from the desk. She didn't know where Mr. X had been headed, but hadn't seemed to like waiting around type. She would head back to Irons' office and see if Sherry had come back for Irons, or Irons for that matter. If X was still there, she could always run. Besides, I should have searched his office, tried to find something about the stars. There's nothing here that can tell me anything. Standing, she took a last look around, wishing that the STARS office had offered little more than a way of supplies of information. All she found of any use was a discarded fanny pack in the desk behind Chris's. According to the expired library cord in one of the pouches, it belonged to Jill Valentine. Claire had never met her, but Chris had mentioned her a couple of times and said she was good with a gun. Too bad she didn't leave one behind. The team had obviously cleared out of all the important stuff after their suspension, though there was still a surprising number of personal items left around. Framed pictures and coffee mugs and the like. She spotted Barry's desk right away from the partly finished plastic gun model on top. Barry Burton was one of Chris's closest friends and a huge friendly bear of a man with a serious gun nut. Claire hoped that whatever Chris was, Barry was with him, watching his back, with a rocket launcher. And speaking of, on top of everything else, she needed to find another weapon, or more ammo for the 9mm. She had 13 bullets left, 1 full clip, and when those were gone, she was SOL. Maybe she should stop and check out some of the corpses on the way back to the East Wing. Even in her panicked run, she'd noticed that some of them were cops, and the handgun was RPD issue. Claire didn't like the idea of touching any of the dead bodies, but running out of any firepower was distinctly less desirable, and particularly with Mr. X running around. Claire walked towards the door and pushed it open, trying to get her thoughts organized as she stepped back into the dim hall. Leaving the office put a damper on her resolve. She had suppressed a shudder in the still vivid image of Mr. X as she closed the door behind her, suddenly feeling vulnerable again. She turned right and started back towards the library, deciding that she wouldn't think about the giant unless she had to, wouldn't dwell on the memory of those blank, inhuman eyes or the way he raised his terrible fist, as if driven to destroy everything in his way. So knock it off already. Think about Sherry. Think about getting some goddamn ammo, or how to handle irons, if you can find him. Think about trying to stay alive. Just ahead, the dark wooden hall turned right again, and Claire tried to steel herself the task ahead. If memory served, there was a dead cop around the corner. Like I can't tell by the smell, and she'd have to search him. She hadn't been too disgusted, at least not that she noticed. Claire turned the corner and froze, staring. Her stomach nodded, telling her that she was in danger before her senses could. The body that she had jumped over on her way to the Star's office was now only a bloody, tangled mess. Flesh and broken limbs and shredded uniform. The head was gone, although there was no way to tell if it had been taken away or just smashed into an unrecognizable pulp. It looked like someone had been taking a sledgehammer or an axe to the corpse in the few moments since she had passed it, beating it into a clotted smear. I didn't hear anything. Something moved. A shadow softened, darting over the smashed remains some 20 feet in front of her, and at the same time, Claire heard a strange, rasping breathing. And she looked up, still not sure what she was seeing or hearing. That ragged breathing and the tick of talons on wood, the talons themselves thick and curved and claws of a creature that couldn't exist. Big, the size of a full-grown man, but the resemblance ended there, and it was so impossible that she could only see it in pieces, her mind struggling to put them together. The inflamed purplish flesh of the naked long-limbed creature that clung to the ceiling, the puffed gray-white tissue of the partially exposed brain, the scar-rimmed holes where the eyes should have been. Not seeing this. The creature's rounded head dropped back, with a wide jaw opening, a ropey stream of dark drool pouring out and splattering over what was left of the cop. It extended its tongue, eely and pink. The rough surface shimmered wetly as it slithered out, and out, and out. The snaking tongue coiled, uncoiling and whipping from side to side, so long that it actually trailed through the rippling flesh of the corpse. Still frozen, Claire watched in horrified disbelief as the incredible tongue slapped back up, flicking droplets of blood through the shadowy air. The entire process had taken only a second, but time had slowed to a crawl, Claire's heart beating fast as everything else in the slow motion. Even the creatures dropped to the wooden floor, its body dripping in midair. A body flipping in midair so that it landed in a crouch atop the mutilated corpse. The creature opened its mouth again and screamed, and Claire was finally able to move as the bizarre hollow shriek erupted from the monster, able to point a weapon and fire. The thunder of 9mm rounds drowned out by the howl that echoed through the tight hallway. Bam! 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 And still screaming that shilling, trumpeting cry, the creature was thrown back, its claw-tipped arms flailing, its spasming legs kicking up bloody chunks of eviscerated body. Claire saw a ragged flap of scalp, one ear still attached, fly across the hall and smack into the wall with a wet, slapping sound sliding down. And the creature got its legs beneath it somehow and flopped forward with a boneless lunge. It spidered towards her, lightning fast, gripping the wood floor with its terrible claws and howling. Claire fired again, unaware that she was also screaming as the 3 more rounds hit the scuttling thing, rippling. Where is it? I lost my pace. Ripping through the gray matter and protruding from its open skull. She was going to die. It was going to be on her in less than a second. Its massive talons were the only inches from her legs, and as suddenly as the attack had come, it was over. Every part of this sinewy body quivered and shook as liquid gray dribbled from the burbling head, the claws tipping wildly against the wooden floor in a frantic tattoo. With a final whispering whine, the creature died. There was no mistaking it this time. She blasted it through the brain. It wasn't going to get up again. She stared down at the monster, her shocked mind digging for something related to, some animal or even a rumored animal that came close, but she gave up after only a few seconds, recognizing it as a lost cause. It was no natural creature, and she had as close as it was, she could finally smell it. The odor that was not as pungent as a zombie's. It was bitter, oily smell, somehow more chemical than animal. And it could smell like chocolate chip cookies. Who gives a shit? Raccoon City's got monsters in it. Got monsters. It's time to stop being so goddamn surprised when you see one of them. The shouting tone of her mind's voice wasn't particularly convincing. As much as she wanted to feel brave and determined to step over the monstrous creatures and get on with things, she just stood for a moment, and for a moment she thought very seriously about going back to the STARS office, going inside and locking the doors behind her. She could hide and wait for help. She could be safe. Decide then. Do something. One way or another, stop this wavering and whining, because it's not just you anymore. Will Sherry be safe? Do you want to be survive at the cost of her life? The moment passed. Claire took a careful step over the raw red flesh of the creature and crouched down over the next to the cop's remains, using the muzzle of her handgun to push the torn pieces of the bloody uniform aside. She swallowed down bile as she poked through the rotted flesh and bone, working not to think about how the cop who the cop had been, or how he died. Nothing, and now she had only 7 bullets left. But she refused to panic, letting the disappointment fuel her determination instead. If she could search one bloody mess, she could search another. With a last look at the dead animal thing, Claire stood and walked quickly towards the end of the corridor. Her decision made. No hiding and no more running from the fear. At the very least, she could take a few of the monsters with her, raising Sherry's chances of escaping. It would be better to die trying than to not try at all. She wouldn't waver again. And there is where we're going to leave off at chapter 15. So, how are you all enjoying them? Are you all following along close enough? I'm not. I feel like I'm rambling over a couple of things occasionally, and it feels really weird to me. Reading out loud. It's been such a long time since I've really done it seriously. Excuse me. So, burping up the Pepsi. Yeah, I'm having fun. I hope you guys are too. I'm not gonna make any spiel about subscribing or whatever. I think everyone here is a subscriber of some sort. Who is a Resident Evil and why is he evil? Good question, Inquisitor Thomas. I'll get back to you on that. So no spiels, no nothing like that. Thank you all so much for joining. For anyone tuning in just now, there's the whole subscribe, do Patreon thing. Shout out to all the lovely patrons that patron me, because I love you guys and thank you for supporting me. And everyone was here for the live stream. I'll catch you all on the flip side.